The sanctuary doors exploded inward with a thunderous crash that silenced 200 voices mid-hymn. Federal agents in tactical gear flooded through the breach, their boots hammering against century-old hardwood as automatic weapons swept across pews filled with families dressed in their Sunday best. Pastor Marcus Brown stood frozen at the pulpit, his Bible falling from trembling hands as laser sights danced across his chest like crimson fireflies. "Nobody move, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The lead agent's voice cut through the sanctuary like a blade through silk, transforming the sacred space into something unrecognizable. Children began crying. Elderly parishioners clutched their chests in shock. The morning sun, filtering through stained glass windows depicting Christ's mercy, cast rainbow patterns across scenes of absolute terror. 3 hours earlier, Marcus had been in his study, reviewing sermon notes while coffee steamed beside his worn leather Bible. The morning had felt perfect. Attendance was up 20% this quarter. The youth program was thriving, and the community center project was finally moving forward after months of careful planning and fundraising. At 52, Marcus had spent nearly 3 decades building Mount Olive Baptist Church, from a struggling congregation of 40 into a pillar of the East Oakland community. "Morning, Pastor." His assistant, Eleanor, had peeked through the door with her usual bright smile. "Mrs. Patterson brought her famous apple turnovers for the fellowship hour, and the Jenkins family wants to schedule a baptism for little Anthony." "Wonderful news." Marcus had looked up from his notes, adjusting his reading glasses. "Any word from the city about the permit extension for the community kitchen?" "Should hear back this week." "Oh, and Karen Whitmore called again about the Interfaith Council meeting. She seemed agitated." Karen Whitmore. The name alone had made Marcus's stomach tighten with familiar dread. As director of the Interfaith Community Alliance and pastor of Riverside Presbyterian, Karen had made no secret of her resentment toward Mount Olive's growing influence in the neighborhood. What had started as professional rivalry had escalated into something darker, more personal, over the past 6 months. The trouble had begun when Marcus's church received a substantial federal grant for community outreach programs. $25,000 to establish job training workshops, financial literacy classes, and a food distribution network for struggling families. Karen had applied for the same grant and been rejected. Since then, she had questioned every decision Mount Olive made, challenged every expenditure, and consistently undermined Marcus's efforts to bring various faith communities together. "She's still upset about the grant decision," Marcus had told Eleanor with a weary sigh. "I've tried explaining that we submitted our application months before the deadline, included all the required documentation, and presented a comprehensive community impact plan. The review board made their choice based on merit." "Some people can't handle losing gracefully," Eleanor had replied, her usually cheerful demeanor darkening. "But the work you're doing matters, Pastor. This community needs what Mount Olive provides." Now, watching federal agents force his congregation to the ground with their hands behind their heads, Marcus wondered if grace had any place in a world where jealousy could masquerade as righteousness. The lead agent approached the pulpit, his face hidden behind tactical goggles that reflected Marcus's terrified expression. "Marcus Brown, you're under arrest on suspicion of money laundering and providing material support to terrorist organizations." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable stripping away another piece of his carefully constructed life. "You have the right to remain silent." Behind the agent, chaos reigned. Children sobbed as their parents were separated and searched. The church's financial secretary, Robert Chen, was being handcuffed near the organ, while agents rifled through donation baskets. Elderly Mrs. Washington, who had attended Mount Olive for 60 years, sat in her usual front pew, weeping as officers examined her purse with latex-gloved hands. "There's been a mistake." Marcus found his voice at last, though it came out cracked and desperate. "I've never had any contact with terrorist groups. Our financial records are completely transparent. We undergo independent audits every year." The agent ignored his protests, continuing with practiced efficiency. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As handcuffs clicked around Marcus's wrists, he caught sight of someone standing in the sanctuary's rear entrance. Karen Whitmore watched the scene unfold with an expression that mixed satisfaction with something that might have been regret. Their eyes met across the pandemonium, and Marcus saw the truth written clearly across her face. This was her doing. The ride to the federal building passed in a blur of shock and disbelief. Marcus stared through bulletproof glass at familiar neighborhoods rushing past, wondering how his life had transformed so completely in the span of minutes. The community he had served faithfully for decades now looked different, foreign, as if he were seeing it for the first time through the eyes of someone else entirely. Inside the interrogation room, Agent Patricia Reeves laid out photographs and documents across a metal table with methodical precision. She was younger than Marcus had expected, perhaps 40, with sharp eyes that seemed to dissect every word before he spoke it. Her partner, Agent James Morrison, leaned against the wall with crossed arms, his expression unreadable. "Let's start with the Syrian connection," Agent Reeves said without preamble, sliding a photograph toward Marcus. It showed him standing beside Imam Hassan Qureshi outside the Oakland Islamic Center during an interfaith charity event 6 months prior. "You've had multiple meetings with known associates of questionable organizations." Marcus stared at the image, remembering that afternoon clearly. They had raised nearly $10,000 for Hurricane Harvey relief efforts, bringing together Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Sikhs in a remarkable display of community unity. That was a charity drive for disaster victims. Imam Qureshi is one of the most respected religious leaders in Oakland. "We've worked together for years on community issues." "Interesting how your charity work coincided with several large cash deposits into Mount Olive's accounts," Agent Morrison interjected, consulting a thick folder. "Deposits that don't match your congregation's documented giving patterns." "Every donation is recorded. We maintain detailed records for tax purposes and grant compliance. Our financial secretary, Robert Chen, is a certified accountant. He can verify every transaction." Agent Reeves slid another document across the table. "According to our source, these transactions represent payments for services rendered to individuals with ties to international terror networks. Care to explain why your church received $15,000 in cash over 3 separate deposits last month?" Marcus studied the bank statements, recognition dawning slowly. Those were donations from our annual building fund campaign. 3 families made large contributions to help fund the community center construction. We have signed pledge cards and thank you letters for each donation. "Convenient," Agent Morrison said with obvious skepticism. "And the withdrawals. Large amounts of cash taken out within days of these deposits. Construction supplies, worker payments, permits. Everything was done with cash because many of our contractors are small. Local businesses that prefer cash transactions. We have receipts for everything." The interrogation continued for hours, each question designed to chip away at Marcus's confidence and credibility. They asked about his travels to a religious conference in Michigan, suggesting it was a training camp. They questioned his friendship with the local mosque's imam, implying secret meetings and hidden agendas. Every innocent interaction, every normal business transaction, Every routine religious activity was twisted into evidence of criminal conspiracy. Meanwhile, back at Mount Olive, the congregation gathered in small groups outside the police tape that now surrounded their sanctuary. Eleanor had called every deacon, every ministry leader, every family that made Mount Olive their spiritual home. They came despite the media circus that had descended like vultures, despite the neighbors who watched from their windows with suspicious eyes, despite the fear that association with the church might somehow taint them by proxy. "This is insanity," said Deacon Williams, a 70-year-old retired teacher whose grandfather had helped build the church's original structure in 1943. "Pastor Brown is the most honest man I know. He's given his life to this community." "Who would make such accusations?" asked Sarah Martinez, the youth minister, whose programs had touched hundreds of teenage lives over the years. "What kind of person destroys a man's reputation with lies?" The answer came from an unexpected source. James Peterson, a maintenance worker for the city, had been replacing streetlights near the federal building when he overheard a conversation between Karen Whitmore and an FBI agent. He recognized Karen from community meetings and knew about the ongoing tensions between the churches. She was saying something about suspicious financial activity and connections to foreign nationals. James told the group that had assembled in Eleanor's living room. But the way she was talking, it sounded personal, like she had a grudge. Eleanor felt her blood begin to boil as the pieces fell into place. She remembered Karen's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit Marcus over the past months, her pointed questions about Mount Olive's finances at public meetings, her barely concealed anger when other churches supported Marcus's interfaith initiatives. "We need to fight back," Eleanor declared, her voice steady, despite the fury building inside her chest. "If Karen Whitmore wants to destroy Pastor Brown with lies, we'll defend him with truth." The next morning brought unexpected developments. Marcus's lawyer, David Goldman, arrived at the federal building with briefcases full of documentation that Mount Olive's board had worked through the night to compile. Bank records, construction contracts, charity receipts, audit reports, testimonials from community leaders, everything needed to demonstrate the church's absolute financial transparency. "My client has cooperated fully with this investigation," David told Agents Reeves and Morrison as he spread documents across the conference table. "These records show that every dollar donated to Mount Olive Baptist Church has been accounted for and used for legitimate religious and charitable purposes." Agent Reeves examined the paperwork with professional skepticism, but Marcus could see doubt creeping into her expression as the evidence mounted. Independent audits from the past 3 years showed exemplary financial management. Construction invoices matched cash withdrawals to the penny. Photographs from charity events demonstrated legitimate partnerships with respected community organizations. "This doesn't explain the intelligence we received about terrorist connections," Agent Morrison insisted, though his tone lacked its earlier conviction. "What intelligence?" David pressed. "Who made these accusations? What specific evidence exists beyond anonymous tips and guilt by association?" The agents exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the weakness of their case. Marcus realized that the entire investigation rested on Karen's false accusations, her deliberate distortion of normal religious and community activities into something sinister and threatening. That afternoon, while Marcus remained in custody, pending further investigation, a parallel drama was unfolding at the Oakland Municipal Complex. Eleanor had requested a meeting with Mayor Patricia Chen to discuss the federal investigation and its impact on the community. What she discovered there would change everything. "I'm concerned about the precedent this sets," Eleanor told the mayor, her voice carefully controlled. False accusations against religious leaders could tear apart the interfaith cooperation that's made our community stronger. Mayor Chen, a practical woman who had worked closely with Marcus on several successful community initiatives, nodded thoughtfully. Off the record, this investigation surprised everyone. The FBI wouldn't share specifics, but the allegations came from someone within the religious community itself. Karen Whitmore, Eleanor said without hesitation. The mayor's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't contradict the statement. Instead, she pulled out a folder that had been sitting on her desk throughout their conversation. Eleanor, there's something you should know about the federal grants that have caused so much controversy. We've been conducting our own review of the Interfaith Community Alliance's finances. The documents Mayor Chen showed Eleanor revealed a pattern of financial irregularities that made Mount Olive's transparent accounting look pristine by comparison. Karen's organization had received multiple federal grants over the past 2 years, totaling nearly $150,000. But the actual community programs funded by those grants bore little resemblance to the ambitious proposals that had secured the money. Job training programs that existed only on paper, Mayor Chen explained, pointing to specific line items. A community center that was never built despite receiving construction funds. Educational materials purchased from companies that don't appear to exist. Eleanor studied the evidence with growing amazement and horror. While Karen had been publicly questioning Mount Olive's financial integrity, she had been systematically embezzling federal grant money intended for community improvement. The accusations against Marcus weren't just motivated by jealousy. They were a desperate attempt to divert attention from her own criminal activities. "How long have you known about this?" Eleanor asked. The investigation began 3 weeks ago, when our accountants noticed discrepancies during a routine audit. We've been working with federal oversight agencies to trace the missing funds. Karen must have realized her activities were under scrutiny. The timing aligned perfectly with the escalation in Karen's attacks against Marcus and Mount Olive. Her increasingly desperate attempts to undermine the church's credibility now made perfect sense as the actions of someone trying to deflect investigation away from her own crimes. "We need to contact the FBI immediately," Eleanor said, her mind racing through the implications. Pastor Brown is sitting in a federal detention facility, while the real criminal walks free. By evening, David Goldman was back at the federal building with Eleanor and Mayor Chen, presenting evidence that fundamentally altered the investigation's direction. Agent Reeves listened to their presentation with the focused attention of someone recognizing how badly her case had been compromised. "You're telling me that our primary source has been embezzling federal funds?" she asked, studying the financial documents with obvious frustration. "The evidence suggests a clear pattern of fraud spanning multiple grant cycles," Mayor Chen confirmed. "Ms. Whitmore appears to have fabricated programs and diverted funds for personal use." David leaned forward across the conference table. "Agent Reeves, my client has been the victim of a calculated disinformation campaign designed to protect the real criminal. Every minute Pastor Brown spends in custody, while Karen Whitmore remains free, represents a miscarriage of justice." Agent Morrison, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "We'll need to verify this information independently, but if it's accurate, we owe Pastor Brown an apology." "You owe him more than an apology," Eleanor interjected, her anger finally breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "You terrorized his congregation, destroyed his reputation, and turned his life upside down based on lies from someone you should have investigated first." The federal agents exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the validity of Eleanor's accusations. They had acted on false information without adequately vetting their source, allowing personal animosity to masquerade as legitimate intelligence. Marcus was released the following morning, blinking in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright after 18 hours in federal custody. The media circus that had condemned him the day before now clamored for statements about his vindication. But Marcus walked past reporters without comment. His mind focused only on returning to his congregation and beginning the long process of healing. Mount Olive's sanctuary had been released from federal custody, but the space felt violated, transformed by the memory of agents with automatic weapons, where families had once gathered in peaceful worship. Broken glass from kicked-in doors crunched under Marcus's feet as he walked down the aisle toward the pulpit, where his Bible still lay open to the morning's interrupted sermon. "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake," he read aloud from the open pages, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "For theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Eleanor found him there an hour later, sitting in the front pew and staring at the stained glass windows that had somehow survived the morning's violence intact. She sat beside him without speaking, offering the comfort of presence rather than words that couldn't address the magnitude of what had occurred. "How do we move forward from this?" Marcus asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we rebuild trust that's been shattered so completely?" "The same way we built it originally," Eleanor replied with quiet conviction. "One day at a time, one person at a time, one act of faith at a time." News of Karen's arrest broke 2 days later, confirming what the community had suspected since Eleanor's meeting with Mayor Chen. Federal agents had found evidence of systematic grant fraud, totaling nearly $120,000 over 2 years. The community programs that had existed primarily on paper to justify funding had never served a single person, while Karen had used the money to maintain a lifestyle far beyond her legitimate income. The arrest took place at Riverside Presbyterian during their Wednesday evening service, creating a parallel to the trauma Karen had inflicted on Mount Olive. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in Oakland's religious community, though Marcus took no satisfaction in watching another congregation experience the violation and confusion he knew so intimately. The Oakland Faith Council had scheduled an emergency meeting for Friday evening at the Interfaith Community Center, a neutral venue that had hosted countless collaborative efforts over the years. Representatives from every major religious organization in the area would gather to address the crisis that had shattered trust and expose the ugly reality of competition disguised as cooperation. Marcus debated whether to attend. Part of him wanted to remain at Mount Olive, focusing on his own congregation's healing, rather than confronting the broader community tensions that Karen's actions had revealed. But Eleanor convinced him that his presence was necessary, that silence would be interpreted as weakness or guilt despite his vindication. "This isn't about proving your innocence anymore," she argued as they sat in his study, reviewing notes for the meeting. "Everyone knows you're innocent. This is about showing leadership when the community needs it most." The community center's main hall was packed beyond capacity when Marcus and Eleanor arrived Friday evening. Local media had positioned cameras near the entrance, creating an atmosphere of public spectacle that made many religious leaders visibly uncomfortable. Rabbi Sarah Goldstein from Temple Beth Shalom greeted Marcus with a warm embrace that spoke louder than any words of support could have managed. "I'm so sorry about what happened to you and your congregation," she said quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've worked together for years. I should have spoken up more forcefully when Karen began making those accusations." "You couldn't have known," Marcus replied, though he appreciated her acknowledgement of the community's collective failure to challenge Karen's increasingly extreme rhetoric. "We all trusted too easily and questioned too little." Imam Hassan Qureshi, approached with several members of his congregation, their expressions mixing relief with residual anger about how Marcus had been treated. The photograph of their charity collaboration had been used as evidence of terrorist connections, transforming their interfaith friendship into supposed criminal conspiracy. "Brother Marcus," the imam said, clasping both of Marcus's hands in his own, "what was done to you was an attack on all of us. When false accusations target one faith leader, every faith leader becomes vulnerable." The formal meeting began with Father Michael O'Reilly from St. Catherine's Catholic Church serving as moderator, a role he had accepted reluctantly after Karen's arrest left the Faith Council without permanent leadership. He was a tall, thin man in his 60s, whose Irish accent had mellowed after 40 years in California, but still emerged during moments of stress or anger. "We're here tonight to address a crisis that has shaken our community to its foundation," Father O'Reilly began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed hall. "False accusations have damaged innocent people. Federal investigations have disrupted our congregations. And trust between our organizations has been severely compromised." The first speaker was Reverend Diana Mitchell from Riverside Presbyterian, Karen's own church, who had requested time to address her congregation's role in the crisis. She was the associate pastor in her 40s, who had worked under Karen's supervision for 3 years, watching the descent from professional rivalry into destructive obsession. "Our congregation is devastated by the revelation of Karen Whitmore's criminal activities," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We trusted her leadership, supported her initiatives, and allowed her personal animosities to influence our church's relationships with other faith communities. We owe Pastor Brown and Mount Olive Baptist Church a profound apology." The crowd stirred restlessly as Reverend Mitchell continued, describing how Karen had gradually isolated Riverside Presbyterian from collaborative projects, poisoning attitudes toward other churches with subtle innuendos and false concerns about theological differences. What had seemed like doctrinal leadership now appeared as systematic manipulation designed to serve Karen's personal agenda. "We were complicit through our silence," she concluded, tears streaming down her face. "We allowed one person's hatred to define our church's relationships, and innocent people suffered because of our failure to speak truth to power." When Marcus stood to respond, the hall fell completely silent. He had not prepared formal remarks, choosing instead to speak from his heart about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. His words would be replayed on local news broadcasts and quoted in newspaper articles for weeks afterward. But in the moment, they were simply one human being addressing others who shared his commitment to serving something greater than themselves. 18 hours ago, I sat in a federal detention cell, wondering if my life's work had been destroyed by lies, he began, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of his words. Today, I stand before you, grateful for the support of this community and mindful of the lessons we must learn from this experience. He spoke about the danger of allowing competition to poison cooperation, the importance of questioning accusations before accepting them as truth, and the need for transparency in all their organization's activities. But most importantly, he spoke about forgiveness, not as weakness or naivety, but as the foundation upon which genuine community could be rebuilt. "Karen Whitmore's actions hurt my family, my congregation, and our entire community," Marcus said, his gaze sweeping across the packed hall. "But hatred cannot drive out hatred. Only love can do that. Only forgiveness can break the cycle of suspicion and retribution that threatens to tear us apart." The response was immediate and overwhelming. People rose to their feet in sustained applause that seemed to release months of built-up tension and fear. Rabbi Goldstein was crying openly, Imam Qureshi nodded with obvious approval. Even the media representatives seemed moved by Marcus's words, their cameras capturing a moment of genuine healing rather than conflict. But the evening's most powerful moment came when Maria Santos, a social worker whose family attended Riverside Presbyterian, stood to address the assembly. She had worked with both Mount Olive and the Interfaith Community Alliance on various projects, giving her unique insight into the contrast between their actual activities and Karen's false portrayal of them. "I want everyone here to understand something," she said, her voice carrying clearly, despite her obvious nervousness. "Pastor Brown's church has fed my family when we had no money for groceries. They've provided job training for my husband when he was unemployed. They've offered after-school programs for my children when I had to work late shifts." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "Karen Whitmore told my church that Mount Olive was misusing funds, that their community programs were fraudulent. She convinced us to withdraw our support from joint projects. Meanwhile, she was stealing money meant for the very programs that could have helped families like mine." Maria's testimony crystallized something that many in the audience had sensed but hadn't fully articulated. Karen's accusations against Marcus had been projections of her own guilt, attempts to divert attention from her crimes by creating false controversies about others' integrity. The meeting concluded with Father O'Reilly announcing the formation of a new oversight committee that would ensure transparent financial management across all member organizations. Independent audits would become mandatory, funding sources would be publicly disclosed, and collaborative decision-making would replace the kind of centralized authority that had allowed Karen's corruption to flourish unchecked. As people began filing out of the community center, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers, supporters, and fellow religious leaders who wanted to express their solidarity. The contrast with his perp walk just days earlier was almost surreal. Where federal agents had once seen a suspected terrorist, his community saw a faithful servant who had endured false accusations with remarkable grace. Eleanor watched from near the exit as Marcus spoke individually with dozens of people, offering comfort to those who felt guilt about their silence, accepting apologies from those who had doubted him, and discussing practical steps for rebuilding trust between their organizations. This was why she had pushed him to attend, despite his reluctance. His presence here tonight was healing wounds that might otherwise have festered for years. The drive back to Mount Olive passed in comfortable silence, both Marcus and Eleanor processing the evening's events and their implications for the church's future. The media attention would eventually fade. The federal investigation would close with formal vindication, and the community would move on to new challenges and opportunities. But the lessons learned during this crisis would shape their approach to interfaith cooperation for years to come. Sunday morning arrived with autumn sunshine streaming through the sanctuary's repaired windows, illuminating pews filled with the largest congregation in Mount Olive's history. Word of Marcus's vindication and Karen's arrest had spread throughout Oakland, drawing visitors from dozens of other churches who wanted to show their support and witness what local newspapers had dubbed a resurrection of faith. Eleanor looked out from the organ where she had played for nearly 15 years, marveling at the sea of faces that included people from every racial, ethnic, and religious background represented in their diverse community. Rabbi Goldstein sat in the third row beside her temple's board of directors. Imam Qureshi had brought a delegation from the Islamic Center. Father O'Reilly represented the Catholic community, while ministers from at least a dozen Protestant denominations filled the remaining pews. Marcus stood at the pulpit where federal agents had arrested him just days earlier. His Bible open to the same passage that had been interrupted by battering rams and tactical teams. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. He was about to deliver a sermon on persecution and vindication in the very space where those themes had played out so dramatically. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." He read, his voice strong and clear. These words from Matthew chapter 5 have sustained believers through centuries of false accusations, unjust imprisonment, and systematic persecution. Today, they remind us that truth ultimately prevails over lies, that justice eventually defeats injustice, and that love conquers hate. He spoke for 30 minutes about the importance of community, the danger of bearing false witness, and the power of forgiveness to transform both victims and perpetrators of injustice. But his most powerful words came at the sermon's conclusion, when he directly addressed the events that had brought so many visitors to Mount Olive that morning. This week, our church family experienced something we never imagined possible, Marcus said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed sanctuary. Federal agents stormed our sanctuary during worship, treating our congregation like criminals based on false accusations from someone we trusted as a colleague and friend. Children were terrified, elderly members were traumatized, and our community's faith in justice was shaken to its core. The silence was complete, broken only by the whisper of wind through oak trees outside the sanctuary windows. Even the media representatives, positioned discreetly near the back of the church, seemed caught up in the solemnity of the moment. But God uses even our deepest trials for good purposes, Marcus continued, his eyes sweeping across the diverse crowd before him. This crisis has brought our community together in ways that years of interfaith dialogue never achieved. We've learned to question accusations before accepting them, to verify facts before passing judgment, and to stand united against those who would divide us through lies and manipulation. When the service concluded with a closing hymn that lifted the sanctuary's rafters, with 200 voices raised in harmony, people lingered in ways that transformed the fellowship hour into something approaching a celebration. Eleanor watched Marcus move through the crowd, accepting congratulations, discussing future collaborative projects, and demonstrating through his demeanor that the ordeal had strengthened rather than embittered him. The final chapter in Karen's story unfolded 6 months later in federal court, where she pleaded guilty to 17 counts of grant fraud, tax evasion, and filing false reports to federal agencies. Marcus attended the sentencing hearing, not out of vengeance, but from a sense that witnessing justice was part of the healing process for his community. Karen looked older than her 58 years as she stood before Judge Patricia Williams to receive her sentence. 3 years in federal prison, full restitution of the embezzled funds, and 5 years of supervised probation would conclude her career as a religious leader and community advocate. But Marcus felt only sadness as he watched her accept responsibility for crimes that had devastated multiple communities. Outside the courthouse, reporters pressed Marcus for comments about Karen's sentence and its significance for the broader community. He had prepared no formal statement, choosing instead to speak spontaneously about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even Karen might find a path toward making amends for the harm she had caused. Justice has been served today, he told the assembled media representatives, his voice calm and measured. But justice without mercy is incomplete. Karen Whitmore made terrible choices that hurt many people, but she's also a human being created in God's image. My hope is that she'll use her time in prison to reflect on the pain she caused and find a way to contribute positively to society when she's released. The questions continued for several minutes, but Marcus's responses remained consistent condemnation of Karen's actions, coupled with compassion for her as a person. Satisfaction with the legal system's vindication, balanced by sadness about the necessity of imprisonment, and determination to learn from the crisis while moving forward in a spirit of reconciliation rather than retribution. 1 year later, Mount Olive Baptist Church celebrated the completion of their community center project, funded through a combination of federal grants, private donations, and contributions from other faith communities throughout Oakland. The dedication ceremony drew nearly 500 people to witness the ribbon cutting for facilities that would provide job training, financial counseling, after-school programs, and meeting space for interfaith collaboration. Mayor Chen spoke briefly about the center's significance for Oakland's future, praising Marcus's leadership and the broader religious community's ability to overcome division through honest dialogue and shared commitment to serving others. The center represented more than just new buildings and programs. It symbolized trust rebuilt, relationships restored, and hope renewed after a period of crisis that had tested everyone's faith in human nature. As Marcus stood before the crowd for his dedication remarks, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The false accusations that had once threatened to destroy his life and ministry had ultimately strengthened his community's bonds and clarified their shared commitment to truth, justice, and mercy. This center exists because people chose cooperation over competition, truth over lies, and love over hatred, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. It stands as testimony to the power of community to overcome even the most divisive attempts to tear us apart. Eleanor, now serving as the community center's executive director, watched from the platform as Marcus cut the ceremonial ribbon while photographers captured the moment for posterity. Around them stood representatives from every faith tradition in Oakland, their presence demonstrating that the unity forged in crisis had matured into lasting partnership for the common good. The afternoon's final speaker was Maria Santos, the social worker whose testimony at the Faith Council meeting had helped crystallize the community's understanding of what had really occurred during those turbulent weeks. She now served on the center's board of directors, her experience with both Karen's deception and Marcus's integrity providing valuable perspective for the facility's mission. When federal agents raided Mount Olive Baptist Church, they were looking for terrorists, she said, her voice strong and clear. What they found instead was a congregation committed to serving others regardless of race, religion, or economic status. This community center is proof that their service was real, that their commitment was genuine, and that their faith can indeed move mountains. As the ceremony concluded and people began touring the new facilities, Marcus found a quiet moment to stand in the center's main hall and appreciate what had been accomplished. The space would soon be filled with children learning computer skills, adults studying for their GEDs, families attending financial literacy workshops, and religious leaders planning collaborative projects. It represented everything that Karen had tried to destroy with her lies, and everything the community had chosen to build through their truth. The last visitors departed as sunset painted Oakland's skyline in shades of gold and crimson, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts and memories of the journey that had brought him to this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, and new tests of the community bonds that had been forged and strengthened through adversity. But tonight, standing in a building that existed because people had chosen hope over fear, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled and faith rewarded. He walked slowly back to Mount Olive's sanctuary, where evening light streamed through stained glass windows that had witnessed both terror and triumph, accusation and vindication, division and reconciliation. The hymnals were neatly arranged in their pew racks. The pulpit Bible was open to tomorrow's scripture reading, and the altar, where he had been handcuffed, now held flowers donated by a Jewish congregation in celebration of the community center's opening. Some wounds leave scars that never fully fade, but healing doesn't require the absence of scars, only the presence of hope. As Marcus locked the sanctuary doors and headed home to his family. He carried with him the knowledge that truth, however temporarily obscured by lies, ultimately finds a way to shine through darkness into light.